So, Renato, how strong are these charges against Eric Adams?
Eh, it's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet.
So, another one bites the dust.
Yeah, and this has been going on for a long time. And this was just from the look of the indictment, a very tough nut to crack. I mean, it's apparent that SDNY has been working on this case for quite some time. They got stymied. A lot of people stonewalled them. A lot of people, according to the SDNY, made false statements to them. And nonetheless, they persisted.
Nonetheless, they persisted. So, let's just do a quick overview of this indictment. So, this indictment basically alleges that New York Mayor Eric Adams was receiving illegal campaign contributions from foreign nationals who were disguising the contributions as legitimate contributions using straw donors. So basically using intermediaries that were U.S. persons to make the payments. There's then a fraud element because he was then using these campaign contributions to receive matching funds from New York, which I guess has some state pot of money that will give candidates matching funds if they raise a certain amount, et cetera, et cetera. So he was doing that. And then in exchange for these foreign contributions, which were coming from the state of Turkey, he was then giving favors back in exchange. So there's a bribery element. So this is multi-layered, and I think it is an intersection really of national security and public corruption. Reminds me a lot of the indictment against Menendez that we saw, in which there was that influence from Egypt. And so we can talk about the foreign influence piece and kind of the national security implications there, but let's first kind of break down the criminal stuff.
Sure. I mean, regarding the indictment, I mean, you mentioned a few different pieces. And what I'll just say from the outset is it's apparent from the face of the indictment that SDNY has some of these pieces really locked down, some of these pieces not so much, in my opinion. The piece that you led with, the campaign finance fraud piece, is interesting. They certainly put a lot of detail on it. But I noticed that a lot of the statements there are from Adam's staffer, not from Adams himself. And they also note that there was false statements that were made allegedly to the FBI by Adam staffer. And I think the big question there is Adam staffer cooperating?
That was my question, because Eric Adams is the only defendant named in this particular indictment, but there were a lot of people involved in this scheme. There was a staffer, there's somebody who's managing his fundraising, there are relatives, then there are business persons. All of these people are, basically unindicted co-conspirators in this indictment. And so I'm reading this trying to figure out, okay, who's helping? Because there are descriptions of conversations that are happening like over dinner. And which unless I guess somebody's wearing a wire, somebody was telling them about this, right?
That's right. But like some of the Adam staffer stuff, it's basically, which are key for that piece. I mean, I don't really know if you can prove up the campaign finance piece of it without Adam staffer saying, yeah, I was directed to do this by Adams himself. Like he knew exactly what I was up to and he was doing it. And I don't see that allegation directly in there. I mean, it's an interesting thing. A lot of times what you do as a federal prosecutor is you have one piece like completely locked down, and then you throw in all this other stuff. And that's like, because when you read the whole thing, it's like, wow, this guy's really in bed with Turkey. And so the jury can make whatever inference they want to make about these campaign finance things. But I don't think on its own, the campaign finance stuff does it. I mean, I actually wouldn't be surprised if the SDNY kind of started there, ran into a brick wall with Adam Staffer, who correctly surmised that she or he would also be in trouble if she or he admitted that, yeah, this is a big fraud scheme and me and Adams were in on it. And that person's like, absolutely not. I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, didn't do that. And they're gonna prove it up anyway because I think the SDNY thinks that they with all the other stuff tossed in, there's enough there or whatever. They want to give the jury the full picture, but that the real meat and potatoes is like this benefits piece that you mentioned, the fire department of New York. I think that is, perhaps the strongest piece of the indictment.
Yeah. So before we get to the what Eric Adams did in return, the way that this was working was that Adam Staffer was in touch with an airline official for Turkish Airlines, which is a state airline. And then there's somewhere in there where the airline official says, "Don't forget, we are the state," or something like
Yeah.
something very like clear. And Adams, according to the indictment, allegedly was basically arranging through his staffer to get luxury trips to India, Turkey, Sri Lanka, all of these places. He would either get free tickets or pay some nominal fee, and then the airline would upgrade him to business class and then give him all of these lavish, perks like airline lounges or set him up in a luxury suite when he got to his destination and sightseeing tours and all of this kind of stuff. This was actually happening for many years with the idea as he when he was, I think, the borough, was it the Brooklyn borough
The
president?
borough president.
And so, leading up to him becoming mayor, with the idea that they were going to cash in once he becomes mayor. So then he becomes mayor, and that's when there's the quid pro quo, where the Turkish consul general basically says, "Okay, it's your turn. We're trying to open up this big skyscraper uh, before the Turkish president visits in advance of the UN General Assembly. It's imperative that this building open. I mean, has been a big production for us, and it matters." The problem is that this building had like major fire code violations, and FDNY wasn't going to sign off to give it the certificate of occupancy or whatever. And basically, Adams intervenes and makes FDNY give them the certificate of occupancy. And so you have like this very clear quid pro quo of an official act in exchange for all of these benefits that he'd been receiving, which from what I understand, Renato, is, I mean, I'm curious what you think of the quality of that allegation, because from what I understand, bribery is often a little bit difficult, right? Because especially when you're dealing with politicians, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that politicians do, and this is going to be his defense is, well, this is what I do. I kind of grease the wheels, and help patrons of our city, to make that direct link that this was in exchange for something of value.
Right. So I think great point, Asha. There has been a lot of um, cutback by the Supreme Court on bribery and what's statute called theft of honest services, which was used, I'd say, to sweep in other types of corrupt acts. But I think that this piece that you just outlined is the strongest part of the indictment. Like the stuff I was referring to before, just to be crystal clear, that is essentially a staffer accepting straw donors and so forth. And there's no real connection to Adams. I mean, Adams is just going to be like, hey, I hire campaign finance professionals and staffers. I don't oversee every dollar raised into my campaign. I have no idea what they're doing. I mean, that's going to be the Adams defense there. But for this piece, it's harder because Adams himself explicitly intervened regarding the fire department, and the fire department clearly didn't like it. because they describe it as like unprecedented. They clearly were bothered by it. And so that piece, I think, is rock solid for SDNY. The piece that he clearly was trying to provide some benefit on the as an official act on behalf of the with the fire department. And that equation that you mentioned, Asha, is the key equation for bribery. Are you trading an official act for something of value? So the way the defense has to attack that piece of it is to say, look, he wasn't really getting anything of value in exchange. Like, sure, he would talk to the Turkish folks. He had many people donating his campaign. Millions of dollars were coming in. Wasn't super focused on the Turks, but this is an important nation, NATO ally. They want to get their thing open. I really, I don't want to disrespect this nation or have an issue with them. New York's a home to all of the international community at the UN, yada, yada. That's what he's going to say. And the problem for him is that unlike the campaign finance piece, where it seems totally insulated from him, as far as I could tell from the indictment, maybe I missed a line here or a paragraph there, but the other piece is more in your face, right? In other words, the not only is the official act something he himself did, but as you point out, Asha, the upgrade to business class, or they have photos in the indictment of some fancy suite that he stayed in, and so on. Now he's gonna just have to say with a straight face, "Hey, I thought it only cost $1,000 for this ticket, not the $15,000 that the list price was, or this suite. I thought we were paying for it. I wasn't really focused on that." But the jury isn't going to like it. It's going to smell bad. And I think the SDNY prosecutors believe that when you take the totality of all of this together, that it is going to be enough to get him convicted on some counts.
Yeah, there was also one smaller thing that I think gets to, in my opinion, I mean, the FDNY piece is obviously the most blatant kind of the quid pro quo, but there was this one paragraph that talks about how the Turkish liaison or official or whoever was in contact wanted to make sure that that Eric Adams did not make any kind of public statement on Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, which is, politically charged, like something that is of interest to the Turkish government, right?
Right.
And he acquiesced on that. Like, to me, that was in some ways even more pernicious, because that's like kind of really doing something for the political image of a foreign country. Like I mean, I don't know that it fits the bribery statute, but in terms of the foreign influence piece and what we kind of are trying to avoid with our public officials is for them to actually do their agenda, or perform their duties in a way that benefits a foreign nation as opposed to benefits the constituents whom they serve. That one just stuck out to me. I mean, I don't think that that's any different than, someone making talking points, or someone, a public official saying talking points that are a benefit to a foreign government, because they're being paid on the sly. I don't know. That just bothered me a lot.
Yeah, and this is the problem for Mayor Adams, because you're coming at it from an angle that's more sophisticated by many leagues than a typical juror, but nonetheless, that's how this is going to. I think that's how jurors are going to react to this. There's a similar allegation, Asha, about him I think disassociating from a particular organization. When the
Mhm.
Turks said this is like the rebels or some sort of group against us, in the opposition to the ruling party supports this group, so you have to disassociate, and he did. I think with that stuff, it's going to be harder for the government. I actually think there's going to be some motion practice in some of that, because Eric Adams would be like, look, I have a First Amendment right to say whatever I want. And yes, people contribute to my campaign. And yes, I have various views, but that doesn't mean you can criminalize me supporting to the Turks or the NRA or the whatever, Planned Parenthood or whoever. Now, there's obviously a difference, and there's a national security component to it. But I'm just telling you how that's going to get attacked. I think that's not what the core piece that
It
SDNY is going to be hanging his hat on.
I agree. I think the downfall of that argument that if Adams makes it is they're not criminalizing the statement. They're using the statement to corroborate that he was trying to advance the interests of a foreign government.
That's right. It's there
You
to
know what
show
I
his
mean?
intent.
It's there
Yes.
to show his intent. It's not they wouldn't be criminalizing actually what he said, like that was illegal or he can't do that. It's the
Right.
lack of it is the lack of transparency, right? Like this is where foreign influence is a problem. Is that in all of these accepting all of these gifts and upgrades and trips and everything, he's not disclosing it. He is not disclosing that, and he was when he first became this I thought was really clever. When he first became Brooklyn Borough president, the indictment says he received certain kinds of upgrades, and he knew to disclose them, and then all of a sudden he stopped. And
Hmm.
the and also, I will push back a little bit on the straw donations piece because there was also deception involved there that to me does go directly to Adams. Like, for example, he would get these campaign donations from straw donors, and then they would have an event with the actual donors, but it wouldn't be listed on his public schedule, and they somehow separated it in time so he could thank them and they could meet him, but not have it linked to the donations themselves. Um, it's not super direct, but it's like it's something that if I'm the mayor, I kind of know what's on my public schedule and what's not. You know what I mean? And what's on the down low, I think.
I think, and this is why I really being careful here to distinguish between what's a legal problem versus what's a jury problem for this guy, is I think the reality of our campaign finance system, I think I could say this with some personal experience or just from what I've seen, is that there are all of these donations that are listed and events that are listed, like, hey, you could pay $250 to get it to this event to meet Senator so and so. Then there's the private luncheon that only select people are invited to, and they're the big mega raisers or whatever they are. And I do think that sure, there's no question that access to public officials is given in a private way, not publicly disclosed, and it's a select group of people. Now I think what Adams is going to say is, sure, I knew these must have been big donors, but I wasn't scouring the campaign sheets to know who was who. I just had staffers giving me note cards beforehand, like, here's the 12 people here, and here's one sentence about them, or something like that. I don't pay attention. I'm so busy. My day's scheduled in 15-minute blocks. I'm swamped from morning till night. I think the problem for him, and this is why I keep drawing this distinction, is that when you're a criminal defense attorney, and I say this to somebody literally, I'm in trial against the Justice Department right now. You have to not just grapple with the legality. You have to grapple with how a jury is going to perceive the whole kit and caboodle of the facts of what's going on. And I think the problem for him is these facts are horrible. And people aren't going to like him trading influence with the Turks, even if there was a legal, even if it's technically legal in some way. That piece of it they're not going to like. And so as long as there's some actual criminal component of it they can hang their hat on, that makes it very, very difficult for him.
Yeah. And I'll actually home in on one more thing, just since we're talking about it, which I think goes to him directly, just because I was like scouring this indictment. So he was trying to get the Turkish university to also give funds through this whole, whatever, creating straw donors. And the goal that had been given for the university was $25,000. But then, the facilitator who was doing this, wanted Adams to meet, um, I guess people from the university or something related to them. And then it says Adams declined the meeting, stating that, quote, they didn't keep their word, end quote, meaning that the Turkish university had failed to fulfill their commitment to make at least $25,000 in donations to the 2021 campaign.
Yeah, it really shows the quid pro quo element of it. I think, politicians generally try to have some sort of separation to that. But it is there inherent in the system. But I do think that it's gonna be a problem for him this fall.
So my question is, I'm curious how much of this was done straight as a public corruption investigation, or whether they came across this from the national security side. I wondered this with
Hmm.
the Menendez indictment too, because if these are Turkish officials who are working for Turkey, then they're fair game for our national security surveillance. Um, we want to know what they're doing, especially if they're acting on behalf of a foreign power. So it's just interesting to me that we're seeing so many of these kinds of things. We saw it not just with Senator Menendez. We saw it with the former SAC of the FBI office. Do you remember that one with Russia,
I
who
remember that case.
had retired and then was, taking influence and evading sanctions and all of this kind of stuff? I just looking at it from my perspective when I was in New York office, this seems like the kind of thing that could potentially be stuff that comes up on, say, a FISA surveillance and then gets passed over to the criminal side. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm curious what you think and if that's possible.
That's interesting. It's possible. I guess the way I looked at it, I mean, it just shows you and our listeners and viewers can get the benefit of two different perspectives, right? Somebody who's in national security in the New York office, and somebody who was a prosecutor, prosecuted a lot of really complex and significant cases, but was not on the national security side. Had tangential involvement in that. I guess from my perspective, the way I looked at it is, the Southern District of New York has a reputation for trying to be very aggressive and pour a lot of resources into prosecutions that are high profile. Sometimes, like we talked about in our last episode, when the crimes don't even take place in New York. And so I viewed them as this was like a big target for them to go after, and they put a lot of effort there. That said, I also think, federal prosecutors tend to be careful. I think the Southern District of New York has a reputation for being far more aggressive than most. In other words, willing to do more coin flipped kind of cases, and just pour tons of resources into them. And I think I think the willingness of any office to do cases that are more challenging is increased when there's some plus factor. And I do think the foreign component was a plus factor here. Just like if there was, for example, like when there's child exploitation or other things that could, or human trafficking, like there's certain things that can genuinely up the stakes for a U.S. Attorney's Office, or on some sort of ongoing harm or loss of trust in law, of the respect for the law and for large communities, something very significant. And here, I think the foreign influence is definitely a component.
Yeah, the foreign influence piece is also really interesting, I think, because it implicates a lot more stakeholders in the US government. So I would
Yes.
imagine that with this kind of indictment, with the Senator Menendez indictment, maybe not with the Russia one, because we're, whatever. We're it's pretty clear that we're mad at Russia. We don't want to stand for their shenanigans. But with certain countries, there are diplomatic interests that are involved. So you have to call in the State Department. And,
Mm.
the State Department has to weigh in and offer their thoughts. And that can be a tug of war sometimes, because what justice wants to do and what state wants to do can sometimes be in tension if there are other geopolitical or national, other interests that are at stake. One case that comes to mind that you might remember, this was actually when our friend Pete Barara was the U.S. attorney in the Southern District, and he prosecuted an Indian diplomat, or he wanted to prosecute an Indian, or he did prosecute. They arrested her, who was mistreating her maid or something. And I think, from what I understand, there had been a big showcase showdown behind the scenes between justice and the State Department that didn't want to offend, because the State Department didn't want to offend India. And somehow they got the green light to do the charges anyway, and then she just got quietly whisked back to India.
First of all, why that I very insightful perspective. I think there's a lot there. I do love the reference to the Showcase Showdown as a Price is Right fan. When I was a kid, I used to watch Price is Right like all the time. So during the summer, it's like on every day, and I love that show. I can still sing all the theme songs. I know all the games, Plinko, and all that. But anyways, putting that to the side,
I always say
uh,
Showcase Showdown. I love it.
I love it. I love that. But putting that to the side, yeah, I think that that makes a lot of sense here. I mean, it's important for our listeners to think about, we've talked in the past, I think maybe 2 episodes ago about this Russia indictment, Russian influence indictment. We're going to be talking in this episode about an Iranian indictment. I think there's no countervailing interest, perhaps. It's more limited, let's put it that way. Then you have Turkey, as I mentioned before, as a NATO ally, and important for that reason. Like we needed their vote to get Finland and Sweden into NATO.
Yep,
So
exactly.
there's a lot there.
And this is
And there's
embarrassing to them. Like this is highly embarrassing to the country, right? Because this is a statement that's being made as much, uh, from the U.S. to Turkey, or the U.S. to Egypt, or whatever is the country that's trying to influence our public officials. It's embarrassing to them, and that's part of what is also being exposed.
indeed.
So speaking of exposure, there was another indictment involving foreign nationals. This was an indictment against 3 Iranians for a hack and leak operation, in which these 3 individuals engaged in, I'll just quote from the indictment, a wide-ranging hacking campaign that used spear phishing and social engineering techniques to target and compromise the accounts of current and former U.S. government officials, members of the media, non-government organizations, and individuals associated with U.S. political campaigns, including, by the way, based on reporting outside of this indictment, the Trump campaign. So I think Trump himself and J.D. Vance.
Correct. I mean, it is apparent, I think, from even the face of the indictment, if you can put two and two together, it's clear they're talking about the Trump campaign. And of course, we've heard a lot of reports of leaked material being sent to journalists regarding the Trump campaign, and journalists not reporting on it. And it's a very interesting difference from 2016, when, of course, the Russian government posted all sorts of information on WikiLeaks to influence the 2016 election. And journalists just ran with that stuff, and the public really went through it. I will just, I guess my one reaction that I have that I think is important is it's very interesting to see from a cyber perspective how they got access. And, some of this was done in the Russian intrusions in 2016. They used, I think, more of a variety of techniques, whereas here it was really sophisticated. When we say, I think when you were saying spear phishing, I mean, it's sort of like, using these guises to convince people that entering their password is actually part of some sort of legitimate activity that they're involved in. And in fact, they're essentially handing their credentials to a bad guy.
Yeah, I would actually argue that it wasn't particularly sophisticated, which Russia's in 2016 wasn't either. Because this is all just tricking your target, right? So it's either the compromised links, or one of the things that they did were to use personas that made it seem like these people were getting an email from someone that they know or could trust, and then manipulating that. And that's something that Iran has done in other contexts. They've done it definitely in the academic context, where, this is just an aside, they once actually hacked into a university website, compromised it, and then sent emails to academics, in the United States who they knew were in touch with dissidents, for example, or were publishing things against Iran, which looked like it was coming from that university and from people at that university. So then these people corresponded and either gave up information directly, thinking that they were talking to somebody that they could trust, or they went and registered for a fake conference and then ended up giving all these credentials, which then the Iranians used to take all of their data and information. Um, so it sounds like that's sort of also something that they were doing here because they actually got a lot of, I think they might have gotten some very like even senior intelligence officials information as well.
Yeah, yeah. They mentioned a former Homeland Security advisor to the president. I assume this is from the Trump administration, given the
Hmm.
nature of the leaks. That's pretty significant, and this is well, we're saying whether you could whether it's sophisticated or not sophisticated, I suppose, depends on one's perspective. But it's definitely, I'd say, the primary way that bad actors can get access into systems, and so a lot of it, it's not just like sending out emails. There's an almost like a social engineering element to it, where it's really meant to deceive.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so the legal charges you see here, there is a fraud element. There are fraud charges. There are also essentially what we might think of colloquially as hacking type charges, but unauthorized access into computer systems and so on. So there's an identity theft element to it as well, and so the types of statutes that I used to charge in more commercial cases, white collar criminal type cases, being used to charge Iranians. And I'll note, Asha, no companies this time. Like unlike the Mueller indictment, where he kind of made the big mistake of charging like the entity that was behind it. It's just the individuals this time.
Yes. And we can get to the purpose of that, but I want to talk quickly about the hack and leak. And you talked about cyber intrusions because I think it is really important to compare this to 2016 in a couple of respects. So, one of the things that happened in 2016 is that there was a sense that intelligence agencies, if they hacked, they did it to just collect information, to
Hmm.
just gather intelligence, and then they went back to their little, caves and analyzed it, and they used that information to inform their political strategy, military strategy, things like that, right? Part of the reason, and I know this from an interview that I did for my Substack with former Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, part of the reason that 2016 caught the FBI so flat-footed was they knew that Russia had hacked the DNC, right? And I don't know if you remember, but I mean, they were kind of slow to follow up on that, and but it was treated as a hacking and intrusion. The counterintelligence side wasn't really involved in that. Only when Russia leaked the information was it suddenly clear that this was being used, that the information was being weaponized. It was sort of like the first time that these two things they understood to be that there was a new strategy involved, that it wasn't just getting the information to inform their own positions or actions, it was to actually weaponize and then use it as a influence against the American public. So since then, what the FBI has done is the cyber divisions actually have embedded in them counterintelligence agents so that they can kind of identify these types of things much earlier. So I think the fact that we're seeing this hack and leak and that it was caught, it seems like I don't know how early, but at least they were able to identify the purpose of it as it was being done is interesting. Second, it shows that Iran is, playing copycat. Like everyone's getting in on the game. That whole technique that Russia used in 2016 was clearly so successful that other countries are like, "Hey, we can do that too." And so, if you can get the information, then you can kind of analyze it. Which brings me to the third point, which is I think it's really interesting that the news organizations didn't bite. As you said, one of the reasons to weapon is at that time, again, we didn't really understand how foreign governments were manipulating the American public this way. So the news organizations just went with it, and they got really into details about the salacious, emails and all of this kind of stuff. Whereas now, I think there's much more circumspection um, once we know that it's hacked material from a foreign government and nobody wants to touch it.
Yeah, and I
Which
really
I think is
think
a good thing. Which I think is a good thing,
I
personally.
do as well. Yeah, I do as well, and I do think that, first of all, I think it's actually ironically, and I wouldn't say I don't think hacking's ever a good thing, but I do think it's valuable now that's kind of happening to both parties,
Yeah.
okay? Because I think when that happens, then everyone can realize, okay, this we can all be victims of this, and we need to focus on the real problem, which is foreign governments trying to corruptly influence our elections. So I do think that's valuable, and I think what really, I mean, we're never going to be able to stop foreign governments from attempting to do what Russia did and hear what Iran has done. But I think just by changing a few incentives and changing a little bit about how we react to it, we can greatly reduce the incentive for foreign governments to do this. I mean, here, what we're really showing Iran is, okay, you did this, you got very little out of it because news organizations didn't bite. Um, and in the end, you're going to have some of your people indicted, and it's realistically not going to have a significant impact on the election. And so, if we do that enough times, and that's the reaction, then we can, I think, reduce the incentive for foreign, adversaries from trying to undermine our elections.
Yeah, and I think importantly, it's not only it's the media that needs to react or not react so that it provides disincentives, but the campaigns also need to react in a way that provides disincentives. And I think it's important here that I mean, it looks like the Biden campaign before Kamala became the nominee got some of this dirt and could have used it and did not. And I think it gets to why it is so bad if a campaign is welcoming hacked dirt on their opponent. This is why the Russia Are You Listening speech was so awful, because what it's basically saying is do it. You have a welcome audience there. Or, if it happens later in summer, I love it. Or all these things that the Mueller report showed where the Trump campaign was, if not colluding, was certainly not going to say no to compromising information on the opponent. And that can also provide incentives for, if you have a proxy that's willing to utilize it to your benefit, then that's just as good as the media picking up on it as well.
Yeah, I agree. And not to go too much in the time machine. But that was, I think, the real problem with the stakes getting raised so much for that portion of the investigation. It was all about whether there was a criminal conspiracy, essentially, between
Mhm.
the Russian government and Trump. And really, what you had, there was no criminal conspiracy. It was never, I thought, never really there's never really a likelihood that could be proven based on the evidence that we knew. But what you saw was essentially the Trump campaign, both in that meeting at Trump Tower, which you were referring to there, if it's what you say, I love it, especially in the summer, to the DMs with
Mhm.
Assange, who was the WikiLeaks guy, to, like you said,
Roger
Russia,
Stone.
Roger Stone. And then, of course, this the Trump statement, Russia, if you're listening. There's a lot of entreaties, right, to the Russians. And if Iran had in fact hacked Joe Biden or Kamala Harris's campaign, and had offered that up to the Trump folks, like, would they have had the same level of restraint? I'm guessing not, given the past activity.
I'm guessing not. And actually, in 2019, there was a bill introduced in the Senate that would have required presidential campaigns to report to the FBI if they received basically Oppo information from a foreign government. And guess who voted it down?
I'm guessing it's not, the lone independent Bernie Sanders and the Democrats. It's the
No, it
Republicans.
was the Senate Republicans. They
Yeah.
actually did not want to make that a requirement, and I mean, I think that is astonishing, and here we are with the shoes on the other foot. Fortunately, I think the Biden administration did the right and ethical thing, but it is interesting that, the Biden administration isn't also attacking the press for election interference, for not publishing the information. Because when we look at, for example, how the Trump campaign and Trump and Vance are treating um, social media platforms that refuse to circulate the Hunter Biden story because they believe that that was
Mhm.
coming from a potentially coming from a hacked operation. I think JD Vance recently said that they're going to fire every FBI and CIA official who, was involved in any of those discussions with social media. Well, that kind of restraint is exactly what's benefiting them right now. And I wouldn't call that election interference. I would call that maintaining the integrity of our election because, I think we want them to just look bad because they look bad, not because a foreign government has skewed our perception of them in a way that nudges people to vote one way or the other. I mean, I guess I would say as long as we're going to have crazy in our elections, the crazy should be made in America.
Yeah, well, I think it was Ken Klippenstein, or I don't know how you say his name, got banned from Twitter, X, whatever it is, by Elon Musk because he retweeted some of the hacked material. And this is the same guy, Musk, who is supposedly trying to expose the efforts to keep the Hunter Biden
The Twitter
materials
files.
at the quote unquote Twitter files, indeed.
No.
So very hypocritical. And that is just par for the course. Really, a different way of operating between the Republicans and Democrats. It would be nice to get to a spot in American politics where both sides agree that we don't want foreign adversaries undermining our elections.
Right. And then to that point, I will just add the reason for bringing this indictment because all three of these defendants are in Iran. They're not going to come into court. They're not going to go to jail. So it's sort of like, what's the point? And as I teach in my class about disinformation and on my Substack, the way that you neutralize influence operations, and not all influence operations involve disinformation. Some of them can involve true information like this, like actual hacked information. But the way that you neutralize what are called perception management operations, as they are called in the Bureau, is you expose them and you basically say this is what they're up to. So now if a news organization were to publish it, they would do it by characterizing it as hacked material from Iran, or people would know that it's hacked material from Iran, by Iran. So they are then evaluating it with that motive in mind. And we've kind of made, to go back to the, you know, diplomatic and geopolitical aspect of this, we're basically saying to Iran, we know what you're up to and cut it out.
That's right. Well, and exposing the individuals involved. I mean, there's a wanted poster
It is a
that
wanted
accompanied
poster.
the indictment. I think that's great, and it's a great effort. But whether or not this actually reduces the incentive for foreign actors to, interfere with our elections, really depends on whether or not the Republicans, or hopefully post-Trump at some point, can move past this and join the, like, let's let America handle its own elections club.
I agree. So, Renato, before we go, I got in trouble in one of the comments on our YouTube page for mispronouncing your name.
Oh my. Well, most people
I'm
do.
sorry. I need to say Renato.
That's true. That's true. Wow, I'm surprised that anyone noticed that. Almost every American pronounces my name Renato, like a deer.
That's what I've been doing.
Yeah, that's what everyone does, and I just accept that. But yeah, my name is Renato. And like people who know me well generally will know to do that. But he's lots since my wife slips up and will call me that. I mean, Renato, because
Do you
that's
want
just I
it
think
do you want it do you want it full, like, Italian act like, "Renato"?
Renato. No, no, that's okay. I will tell you when for most of when I was growing up, I was so ashamed of my name because I would get teased all the time. And there's a lot of ways to make fun of my name. It really wasn't. I was named after my grandfather who had immigrated here on a boat, and I it wasn't until he died when I was in high school that I decided to keep the name because I was actually planning when I went to college to go by my middle name,
What's your middle
um,
name?
Thomas, which is my other grandfather's name, and so R. Thomas Mariotti, which would have been much easier to pronounce, Tom.
Well, that's interesting that you say that because everybody mispronounced my first name growing up. So, my first name is Renuka. How would you say that?
Renuka,
Okay. So, the proper Indian pronunciation is Renuka,
Renuka.
Renuka, but everyone in school called me Renica. And then sometime in high school, Ren and Stimpy got big. And so then,
Ah,
like, people would start, like, quoting Ren and I don't know, imitating Ren and Stimpy, and it just got really annoying, and no one I went through the whole thing where, especially early on in school, in elementary school, even into middle school, when teachers would go down and call the names, they would skip my name.
wow.
So they would get to the end and be like, "Did I miss anybody?" And then I would raise my hand, and I don't know why, just, like, they could just stop and ask me how to pronounce it. Maybe they were just afraid when they saw the name or something like that. I mean, later as I got my teachers got to, they knew who I was, they would say it. But finally, I just got to a point where, like you, when I graduated from high school, I was like, "I'm gonna go by my middle name." Um,
Wow.
so, yeah, so I started going by Asha, and that's why I know a little bit about when people from different ethnic backgrounds start going by an easier to pronounce and, um, you know, more, in some cases, more anglicized names. It is usually an attempt to try to assimilate.
Yeah, and also just to reduce like friction in your life, right? Like you have to deal with it's uncomfortable to have to deal with people who treat you differently, right?
Yes.
Because of your name.
What I
It's
love is there's like so many Indians who will totally go to just like some American
right.
Anglo name. So, and my dad was the funniest because my dad's first name is Jai.
Okay.
Okay. Which you would think is like a super easy name to just go by in American society.
It's
Everybody called him
common actually.
he went by Jack.
Jack. Wow. That's
He
like me
was
going by Tom. That's like
Yeah,
that, right?
he was Jack, and then my mom's name is Vinaya, and she went by Vinny. So they were Jack and
Wha-
Vinny.
Oh my God, that's so funny.
Yeah.
That's so funny. My law school roommate was his name was I would pronounce it Rohit. I learned later it was Rohith,
Rohit.
uh, and now he goes by
It's by
Ro.
Ro. Well, it's not Bobby.
There you go. Exactly, Bobby Bobby Jindal. That is crazy, right? But it is interesting. But for me, I just accept it, and I actually am proud of the fact that I got an unusual name now. It actually means people remember me more because my name is unusual,
Same.
and so yeah,
And
same for you.
you can call me Reinica if you want.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.